sustainability certification, especially for SAF. It shows us the feedstock, it shows us the sustainability and viability, and then also helps prove our documentation flow and our GHG emissions values. So we have a fully robust and traceable system. And how do we do this? That's often the next question. So we have sustainability certification, we understand a bit more about what it is, how it works. It often functions under different certification systems, so to say. A lot of new terminology, a lot of spaces, but if we take the idea of ISCC, we can really look to three primary certification systems for SAF. The first of which is ISCC EU. Now this is one of the officially approved schemes under EU RED 2, as well as EU RED 3 sustainability criteria. So it's approved for SAF claims under the UK ETS, the EU ETS, Refuel EU, so on and so forth. So the certification enables airlines and associated partners to showcase compliance with mandates or obligations. And as I mentioned very recently, ISCC EU has been expanded to include RF&BOs and recycled carbon fuels. So looking at certification, this is the EU space. Quite a large presence in Southeast Asia and the APAC region for EU certifications. We'll dive into that just a bit later, but wanted to briefly remind us of what it is now. Next, we can look at ISCC Plus. ISCC Plus is actually the homegrown, the self-developed solution ISCC made to look specifically at voluntary markets. Now, when I mentioned ISCC is working within many spaces, not just energy, not just fuels, this is where we most often see that. ISCC Plus is used for food, for feed, for petrochemical, for packaging, really a wide array of products. I believe most recently was the new Mattel Barbies, or ISCC certified for biocircular plastic material. So quite a few different spaces, but we do see SAF and marine fuels, but SAF especially, really increasing in use with ISCC Plus. For the scope 1 and 3 voluntary markets, not falling under any regulatory category, ISCC Plus is really a viable option. But then, last but not least, is ISCC CORSIA. ISCC is one of 3 schemes recognized to provide certification to showcase compliance under ICAO CORSIA. It's also explicitly mentioned in the SBTI guidance for ISCC certification. So again, not looking at any other market other than SAF, which I believe we're all aware of, and really seeing quite a lot of growth under ISCC CORSIA as well. So we have all of these different certification schemes, certification systems. Often we see suppliers in the industry challenged and trying to understand, what do I really need then? So I'm a SAF producer or I'm a feedstock collector. Do I get EU? Do I get CORSIA? Do I get Plus? How does this impact the supply chain? So while this is quite a challenging question, and it depends a lot on market nuances, I think it's important to note that from an ISCC perspective and a greater certification perspective, not just from ISCC, but from others such as RSB, we all do our best to harmonize systems where we can. Now, naturally, ISCC EU and ISCC CORSIA stem from regulation. ISCC has no power, no say to change the regulation. We can't change the requirements. What we can do is harmonize the way the certification and auditing processes actually work to make it easier for operators to have multiple certifications. So that SAF producer can, for example, in one go achieve ISCC EU and ISCC CORSIA certification, if they so desire. So in spaces such as the risk management and traceability systems, integrity checks, audit assessments, the registration process, all these nuances to obtain certification, most of the certification systems are relatively and completely aligned. So then operators wishing to achieve multiple certifications can do so relatively streamlined process and manner. I thought it was important to briefly note where we start to see sustainability certification. We've mentioned EU, which of course I believe we all know. We've mentioned ICAO CORSIA, which is quite a pertinent topic. But as we continue to see evolving regulatory frameworks, mandates, obligations pop up around the world, this is ever changing. I know this is quite an outdated map, especially in comparison to others that we've seen. It's nigh on impossible, I think we all know, to follow all of the different regulatory and obligation discussions occurring around the world for what's upcoming in the next few years. But as an example, many of them are looking towards certification as a check to showcase that their sustainability requirements are being met. We can look to certain policies within Canada Clean Fuels Regulation, which most recently recognized ISCC Plus. We can look to certain policies within Japan, new conversations evolving within India, within Korea, as we've discussed here, within Malaysia, Indonesia. Many of these regulators are exploring how certification can actually showcase targets against their own mandates and obligations. And that's something we at ISCC are very heavily invested in, very heavily engaged in, so we can keep the market as simple as we possibly can. Independent sustainability requirements are incredibly important. Countries, organizations, and regulators showcasing their own needs are extremely valuable, but from our perspective, it's also important to remember that the market can only handle certain amounts of workload, so to say. It's important to streamline requirements where we can. We have a number of regulatory fronts facing us in the future, and as such, we should streamline and use existing systems to make it more straightforward as the process continues to evolve. So we've floated around ISCC CORSIA, ICAO CORSIA. We at ISCC have seen tremendous growth under ISCC CORSIA in the past 365 days, as an example. I believe when I started at ISCC about 2 years ago, there were 70 certificates, so 70 organizations that had been audited and approved under ISCC for CORSIA. Now, we have seen 542 organizations certified under CORSIA. In the past year, this signals about a 400% growth. So really substantial and really tremendous growth. From our perspective, we see this as a signal that the market is starting to ramp up for CORSIA fuels. I know this has been a huge discussion in the past months and years on availability of CORSIA material, airlines uplifting it, and in discussions here this week, it's been quite a chicken and egg situation. If the airlines look to purchase it, supply will follow, but without such demand signals, it's really quite a challenge. But to dive into it a bit deeper, quite importantly, within these 542 certificates, 63% of them were in the APAC region. So that in itself is huge, incredibly important. Showcases our earlier point that this is an incredibly important region of the world when it comes to SAF. And to break that down even farther, when we look to the ASEAN countries, this is 140 certificates. So 26% of all certificates under CORSIA that ISCC has is within this region right here. Incredibly important metric and showcases the willingness and desire to continue to move forward in the space from this region, as they're plainly seen the leaders in the certification space, both for the feedstock, both for production, and I believe this will continue forward into the future. Now, in an effort to try and streamline our conversations to get a little deeper understanding into the certification process, I wanted to give a brief overview of how ISCC interacts with regulators, certification bodies, accreditation bodies, producers, feedstock suppliers. It really can be a complex ecosystem, and depending on the scope of work with which you work under, this could be old information. I hope so. But to break it down, we can really imagine this almost as a tree, so to say. At the top of the tree, we have ICAO CORSIA or EU Commission, just for examples as regulators. These regulators pass recognition and surveillance requirements into organizations such as ISCC. They detail the sustainability requirements that they want for their obligation, for their mandate, whatever it might be. ISCC then takes these and translates them in a way into a certifiable recognition framework, develops audit procedures, develops system documents, if you're familiar with ISCC, that outlines all the rules, the requirements, and what operators have to follow. Now, this is done on the basis of the specific entity. So, of course, if we look at a farm or plantation, they will have different sustainability requirements compared to a SAF producer, or a SAF trader, or a SAF blender. Each of these unique scopes have their own requirements. Now, following the certification process, all of these operators, regardless of what they are, generally submit annual feedback and annual reports into ISCC. ISCC then takes this, puts it together, packages up nice and neat, and then provides it to regulators. Here's where we're seeing pain points, here's where we're seeing challenges, this is what the future looks like. So the regulators can then adjust regulation if it's possible, and then disseminate it back down throughout the marketplace. But I think one of the most important things to recognize on this slide is ISCC ourselves are not providing audits. We're not on the ground as ISCC auditing the facility. We work with certification bodies who do this. So I myself personally, I have never been to an audit for a CORSIA facility. And while a bit disappointing sometimes because I'd like to see it, we do it on purpose. We're neutral bodies then, we're not looking into each operator ourselves. As I mentioned, we cooperate with 67 different certification bodies around the world who showcase that their auditors have been trained under aviation frameworks, for example. They understand supply chains in agriculture or waste residues. They have experience within fuels markets, whereas personally I would not. So these are neutral third bodies who complete the requirements. But in order to even have a cooperation agreement with ISCC, these certification bodies must have the appropriate accreditation in order to then even perform audits. So it really is a quite complex and unique entanglement, so to say, of different organizations. So really, to sum it up then, we can look to the regulators, making the rules, making the frameworks. ISCC is translating them, cooperating with certification bodies to provide trained auditors who then go on site to the entire supply chain to complete the audit. Those auditors in turn and the certification body themselves have received accreditation from a recognized accreditation body. Now, that's not to say we're not engaged with all parts of the discussion, and we rightfully are, but ISCC as ourselves has no right and no influence over regulation. We're in communication and we help implement, but we're not the police, so to say, of the world, and we don't have the ability to change regulation. Now, as such, there's a wide array of different entities here today, all of us coming from different perspectives. Some airlines, some feedstock producers, some SAF producers. I wanted to take a moment to showcase what documentation traceability looks like within the SAF supply chain, as this is quite a nuanced space that I believe some of us sometimes miss. First and foremost, we have to break SAF down into the point of origin. What is the feedstock we're looking at? Are we looking at a waste, a residue byproduct, most commonly seen under EU RED frameworks? Or are we looking at agricultural crops, residues in that space, which we see more often going under ICAO CORSIA? But as such, the first two organizations, or the first 2 points within the supply chain, would be the point of origin for that waste. The example of UCO would be the restaurant, or the actual agricultural field, the farm, for the crop itself. Those entities are not required to be certified under ISCC or under regulation. However, they do have to provide documentation and proof that the material they are handing over complies with requirements under each regulation. But from that point forward, looking at the first gathering point in an agricultural setting, we're looking at a collecting point for the waste residue byproducts. From that point forward, regulation requires that each and every economic operator touching the feedstock or touching the final fuel, with a couple amendments, is certified. If we see, for example, a collecting point or a trader that is non-certified, that is handling certified material, the output of that batch, the output of that supply chain is considered non-certified material. It's considered conventional product or conventional jet. Now, I say loosely that every entity is required to be certified, because once again, this differs based on their regulatory requirements. So for example, the downstream trader under ICAO CORSIA is a voluntary certification. Anything after the final blending of the SAF under CORSIA frameworks is considered optional. But however, also under CORSIA, if that blender, for example, is not certified, their output is conventional jet. They're not allowed to sell it or to showcase it as certified material. Very similarly, under EU RED requirements, except that downstream trader is also required to be certified up into the airport gate. But in terms of documentation, the way it actually works, historically it was paper documentation flow from that point of origin or farm all the way through into the airline. Now, as we've seen from some of our earlier speakers, this has been improved upon and is in some cases technologically driven via apps or emails or different processing centers or ERP systems. But traditionally, we still see paper documentation flowing through, sometimes emails, vice versa. But the important thing to realize here is that within our traceability requirements, we see that documentation flow from each and every entity into the next. We see the self-declaration from the restaurant, for example, into the collecting point. We see an SD, or a sustainability declaration, moving through the supply chain after that, which, until when we reach the renewable fuel producer, it becomes a POS, or a proof of sustainability. So for those working within SAF, you've probably seen the ISCC template, a blue document that showcases all of the sustainability criteria, the information on the fuel itself. That's called a POS. From there, that's often handed into airlines, which airlines can utilize to make their own claims, which is checked by the MRV, which ISCC has no interaction with whatsoever. But also important to note here is where our GHG value calculations come into play. These documents, are included and passed from every entity in the supply chain, and that is where we add the GHG information. So looking at the feedstock collection and production, the emissions from cultivation, direct land use change if it applies, upstream transport is all added into this document. As we look further downstream, the processing, the downstream transport, perhaps any carbon capture storage if it applies, or combustion as well, also is added into the document. But also, incredibly important to note, maybe the most important point of my discussion here, is that these values are checked by an auditor. It's not simply that an organization states, this is my emissions value, here it is, we're done. These values, if they're actual values, are verified by an auditor at the yearly review cycle. Under ISCC, audits have to be renewed every 365 days. So operators who are certified under ISCC, in many cases, are audited on-site once per year to verify the compliance with the regulation and with ISCC requirements. Now we're nearing the end here. I'd be remiss if I didn't have a very small section on voluntary SAF usage. It's been a huge theme throughout our discussion in the past few days. ISCC, while mostly working within the regulatory space, is very attuned to this conversation as well, and is doing our best to support how we are able to. Now, as such, ISCC about 4 years ago started developing the ISCC credit transfer system, which is our solution for a registry. This was released early last year. Understanding, of course, there are many registries on the market, but wanted to provide a system for our own system users, our own association members, to track and manage their Scope 1 and Scope 3 SAF claims. From our perspective, this essentially functions as an extension of the certification process. We could be looking, as we mentioned, at the beginning point of the feedstock, all the way into the very end of the supply chain, where certification requirements end at that downstream trader. But then there's a gap between the downstream trader, the airline, and the Scope 3 customer. So as I mentioned 4 years ago, ISCC saw this gap, started developing a technical solution. That would be the ISCC credit transfer system. It is a way to connect those POSs, the downstream supply chain, into the airlines, the fuel suppliers, and that Scope 3 cover customer. So together with our partner organizations and other individuals and corporations that have joined the system, working really in close collaboration on our version of the book and claim hybrid model to showcase true and accurate Scope 3 claims. Rather than just saying, this is the Scope 1 claim, this is the Scope 3 claim, we back it up with auditable proof. So operators, SAF suppliers functioning under the ISCC credit transfer system also undergo auditing requirements. So then airlines and Scope 3 customers have the ability to make a very strong Scope 1 and Scope 3 claim, again from our own perspective. We really break this down into 2 separate pieces. In typical ISCC fashion, there's a system document that outlines all the rules and procedures, but then the actual online registry itself, the bank account, so to say, for our Scope 1s and Scope 3s. So to just wrap it up here, I believe you've heard enough from me, and I believe there's only a couple sessions to wrap us off for the entire event. Just a few concluding thoughts from the ISCC perspective. I believe it's quite clear that feedstocks will be constrained. We've heard this from many of the speakers throughout the conference, but also throughout many of the events that we attend. I believe regulation will continue to look forward in broadening feedstock bases and understanding how robust sustainability certification can underpin this, how we can utilize certification to look at even more feedstocks, for example. Now, this becomes increasingly important as we see regulatory schemes around the world are expanding. Again, quite clear, we've had this discussion by many speakers throughout the past few days. Looking at mandates on many different country-specific levels, region-specific levels, international levels, most of which are utilizing the same feedstocks. On one positive sign, this gives a very strong sign of demand certainty for SAF production, for feedstock usage, but on the other side, it showcases possible constraints for the entire industry. But this also provides us not only the opportunity to grow, but on the flip side, it increases complexity. Understanding how operators, system users from ISCC lingo, producers, can understand EU regulatory requirements, understand CORSIA regulatory requirements, understand the requirements for their own country, their own state. So the system is getting increasingly complex. But as this continues to grow, we can also look to new certification approaches. So for example, ISCC is piloting under low land use change risk certification and have actually provide certificates under this framework. Additionally, piloting new projects underway under LCAF, or low carbon aviation fuels. It's one of the 2 fuels offered as acceptable under ICAO CORSIA frameworks. So there are many new pathways that I believe collectively, all of us in this room can help support, engage in, and understand a good path forward. And last but not least, as we just briefly mentioned, we're seeing the SAF market really being stood up by voluntary markets. As regulations continue to kick in around the world, ISCC perspective is that voluntary markets will play an increasing role in overall SAF demand for the foreseeable future. And that's something that we are continuing to support and understand how the market is engaged so we can continue to do so into the future. With that, as I mentioned, I think that's probably enough for me. Very happy to be here, very happy for the opportunity, and similarly would be happy to take any questions that you might have.